Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Church Coffee, Christianity, Conservatism, and Culture. Today I'm talking about bridge building with other faiths, specifically Islam and Muslims, with an immigrant in Canada, Louis Dizon, who's currently in a PhD program at University of Toronto. Louis, welcome to Church Coffee.
Hey, it's nice to be here.
First and foremost, I think we're both drinking coffee right now, but how
Yeah.
do you take your coffee?
Yeah, a lot of the times recently, what I would do is I'd mix it into a protein shake. So, like, I'd toss it into a blender with some milk and some whey protein and make a nice little smoothie.
You getting swole up there in the dark north?
Yeah, well, in the winter, you need muscle because muscle helps keep you warm.
No polar bears near you, I
No,
hope. Well, give us
only black bears and the occasional coyote.
your story. Tell us a quick bio of your life.
Well, okay, so I grew up in the Philippines. I moved to Canada when I was 17. I have a bit of a whirlwind religious experience. So the short version of it is that I grew up Catholic. In my teen years, I became an atheist agnostic after reading some new atheist literature. And then after that, I came to my senses and became Christian again. But I was like an evangelical. I dabbled in Reformed theology for about a decade or so of my life. And then around 2018, I returned to Catholicism. So I've been Catholic again ever since. So basically, just went full circle and went back to what I grew up in. Now, the topic of our discussion is about my engagement with Muslims. So you want me to talk about how Islam and Muslims fit into all of that? All right. So it all starts with my upbringing in the Philippines. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but there's actually a large Muslim population in the Philippines. They constitute about, I want to say, 5 or 6% of the population there, mostly in the south. I lived in the north, but we did have some Muslims in the north as well. Like I remember going to the supermarkets and seeing a bunch of Muslims praying, and nobody really explained to me what they were doing. So, from my perspective, it just looked like they were bowing to nothing in particular. I would also occasionally see like women in the stalls wearing their head coverings. We actually did have a Muslim come to our class once. I went to a Catholic school, but to build bridges between the faiths, they had some Muslims do a presentation on their faith, so we knew what they believed. The only thing any of us got out of that was, oh, Muslims can marry more than one wife. Yeah, that's how the teenage male brain works. But anyway, I moved to Canada when I was 17, as I mentioned, and here we do have a significant Muslim minority. It's hard to figure out precisely how many right now, but last I checked, in the Canada-wide, they make up about somewhere between 3 to 4% of the population. And here in Southern Ontario, they make up as much as 10% of the population. So that is quite a significant number. 1 in 10 people you'll see here in Toronto is Muslim. My interest in the religion started around 11th grade. This was during my Protestant evangelical phase. I was going to a secular public school, which had a lot of different faiths and cultures represented there. And I happened to have a number of Muslim classmates. There were two in particular. Their names were Basil and Nofal, and they were Ahmadi Muslims. I don't know if you're familiar with the Ahmadi sect, but mainstream Muslims don't actually consider them Muslim because of some heterodox beliefs that they hold, but that's a whole nother story.
Yeah,
But
if anyone's familiar with Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, that would be Nabil Qureshi's story. I would, in my own study of Islam, I also would roughly compare Ahmadi Muslims to maybe Jehovah's Witnesses or even Mormons,
yeah.
ones that are, maybe on a tertiary or fourth sphere out from the mainstream. Definitely
Yeah.
like any mainstream Muslim, just like any hopefully mainstream Christian would consider them at least with a side eye, if not full, like, mm,
Right.
no.
See, The way I look at it, since I am not a Muslim, it is outside of my purview to decide whether these groups are really Muslim or not. So I take no firm stand either way. The only thing I will say is these people present themselves to me as Muslim, so I will treat them accordingly. They want to quote to me all the standard Muslim stuff, the Quran, etc. I will respond in kind. But anyway, back to the story. My friends Basil and Nofal were very active in the Ahmadi community. In fact, Basil is a missionary with their sect right now. He does a lot of outreach for them. But even back then, they were very interested in propagating their faith. Like we would get into a lot of discussions about religion. They would question me about specific beliefs and practices that I have as a Christian. And at one point, they gave me a book by one of their former leaders. I believe the title of it was Christianity, A Journey from Facts to Fiction by Mirza Tahir Ahmad, who was their preceding leader right before the current one. And he had a bunch of arguments there about why Christianity is false, showing why you can't trust the Gospels and why Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. They hold to the swoon theory, which is another one of their idiosyncratic beliefs. Most Muslims believe that someone else was crucified instead of Jesus on the cross. They believe that Jesus was on a cross, but he fainted, he was comatose, and then he revived and went to India. But anyway, that was very interesting. And I was reading their book and I thought to myself, you know what? These are some really interesting arguments, but I'm not buying it. So let me go do some research on some of these claims and see how I can respond to them. So I went on the internet, started doing research, regarding Christian apologetics and how to respond to these types of arguments. And that sent me down the rabbit hole of Christian versus Muslim debates. That's when I started listening to all of the big names in that sphere, people like Sam Shamoon, David Wood, James White, Tony Costa, etc. And I familiarized myself with like the talking points that both sides would throw at each other. So I would compare that with the claims that my friends were making and claims that their book was making, and I would tell them my responses to specific arguments in that book. Now, our conversations went on till the very end of high school. At that point, I decided, you know what? All this stuff is really interesting to me. I want to continue studying it at an academic level. So I went to the University of Toronto and I enrolled in the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations, which encompasses both biblical studies and Islamic studies. So it was useful to me because I can do both offense and defense simultaneously in my studies. I can defend the Bible while simultaneously learning about Islam so that I can critique it. Now, actually, funny thing, some of the people who follow me may know that I'm good colleagues and friends with Khalil Andani, who is a theologian in the Ismaili Shi'i sect. I actually met Khalil when he was a master's student in the same department. His final year at the University of Toronto coincided with my first year there, and we actually took one course together. It was a course on early Islamic history. So it was rather fortuitous because we kept in touch ever since, and now we do a lot of work together. And whenever I need someone to present an opinion on Islam that is other than the majority Sunni position, he's usually the first person that I would turn to for that. I did that for my undergrad, and then my master's was in Wycliffe College. I did a master's of theological studies, and then after that, I went back to the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Civilizations for my PhD. I'm doing it under Dr. Walid Saleh, who is best known for his work on tafsir studies. He
What is tafsir studies for those who
so a
don't know?
tafsir is basically a commentary on the Quran. So he specializes in classical Quran commentaries, and his claim to fame is his work on al-Biqai, who was a 14th century Muslim scholar who wrote multi-volume text called the Nazm ad-Durar. I actually have some copies behind me, which I borrowed from the University of Toronto libraries. They're sitting on the floor right now. But al-Bekai is interesting because he cites the Bible a lot in his writings, more so than any other Quran commentator up to that point. In fact, the use of the Bible in the Quran commentaries was very rare prior to the 19th century. There are only like maybe a couple of Quran commentators who ever actually do that. That makes al-Bekai unique in that regard, and also controversial in his time for doing so. Now, my dissertation happens to also look at al-Bekai. I'm largely focused on comparing him with another figure, Ibn Hazm, who is best known for writing polemics against other religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, and to a lesser extent, other sects of Islam. He wrote a Ibn Hazm wrote a multi-volume work on religion where he tries to refute every other religious belief other than his own. I happen to have a copy of that as well somewhere, not behind me right now. But Ibn Hazm and al-Bekai are basically the two main protagonists, you could say, in my dissertation. So I would look at biblical passages that are cited in both of their writings, and I would compare and contrast their methodologies and how they would handle the text that they cite.
You're pretty active in the multi-faith bridge building space. You're on YouTube a lot. We know each other actually from Twitter, and I also know you do very good work on the ground, so to speak. What first
Mhm.
brought you out of academics and more to a on the ground approach? It sounds like you had already made
Oh,
friends and stuff. So what I guess better question is
hmm.
what kept you in a bridge building multi-faith arena?
I mean, I've always been in that mode. Academics has always been a means to an end. The end being, of course, the bridge building that you mentioned, but also, apologetics, which is the flip side of that. It's also interfaith, but more in a sort of like dual, like combative sense. I don't want to say combative, but that's how it usually ends up being, unfortunately. But it's my journey in this field of study started with interfaith dialogue, so it's very fitting that it would continue as such. I've always been involved in interfaith dialogues throughout the entire period that I've been studying this stuff. Um, in fact, yeah, I remember there would be various Christian Muslim dialogue sponsored by different churches and mosques throughout the Greater Toronto area, and I would always attend them whenever I can. A lot of the recent stuff I've done has been online, mostly through Reason in Theology. So, we would dialogue with people like Khalil and Danny, Javed Hashmi, Shabir Ali, etc. So of course, the main purpose of all this is so that, first, so that Christians can have an accurate understanding of Islam, but also so that Muslims can have an accurate understanding of Christianity. And when both sides have discussions with each other about the respective faiths, it'll come from a place of knowing what the issues are and being able to accurately represent them without straw manning.
On the ground, and you're of course speaking from a Canadian Toronto oriented space, but what kind of points of agreement do you see between Christians and Muslims? And I guess this would be more in a
Mhm.
social, political sense, but what sort of agreements do you see
Yeah.
meeting in the middle on?
I can tell you about a couple of issues that have come up in the province of Ontario, particularly during the past 10 years. So I remember the first one was back in 2015, where the province when it was introducing a new sex ed curriculum, and a lot of traditional religious people were up in arms about that. You had both Muslims and Christians rallying to decry this new sex ed curriculum because it was corrupting the values of children. So, it was I forget who coined the term, but it's called ecumenism of the trenches. It's when you get people of disparate faith backgrounds together to basically combat an issue where both of them are on the same side. So this was one such example. More recently, in the past year, past 2 years, there's been some issues around transgenderism. So stuff like gender neutral washrooms, introducing trans type material in schools. And it's actually been the Muslim community that's been spearheading a lot of that. Muslims are pulling their kids out of the public schools. They're protesting in front of the provincial legislature. And then Christians, of course, agree with all these. So they would sign on and join in these protests. So a lot of these social progressive issues do end up causing Christians and Muslims to rally together to oppose them.
Yeah, that's my experience as well. I'm in a small southern city with the only mosque in probably I think 80 miles, but anytime I've gone there, definitely get the
Mhm.
sense of pretty socially conservative. Yeah, I
Mhm.
also often think it's quite beautiful in a kind of
Mhm.
flat social sense because I'll see doctors and businessmen next to people with immigrant garb, mostly East African or Middle Eastern, next to people in janitorial costumes, old, young, babies crying. It's I actually think on that level, it's kind of beautiful. They're all these social classes and all these different cultures are maybe not forced,
Yeah.
but they are brought
Yeah.
together by their faith under one. And I know that's different because in the West we're Christian or
Mhm.
Christian-esque and
Yeah.
everyone's kind of splintered off. And I know you're Catholic, I'm Protestant, but I'm
Mm.
sure even within Catholicism, I see that here that different churches are kind of specialized. There's definitely a Hispanic church
Mhm.
here. There's definitely the more
Right.
traditional Catholic church that you can go to that does Latin Mass on Saturdays. And then
Mhm.
there's the kind of big, much more broader Catholic church. And those are the three in my area.
Here, there's definitely a lot of ethnic ghettoization happening in the city of Toronto. So a lot of churches, both Catholic and Protestant, tend to cater towards specific immigrant communities. In Scarborough, where I live, not as much. Most of the parishes here are multi-ethnic, although because of where I live, it's mostly Filipinos and South Asians. I will say this about the whole conservative Christian thing. Uh, I find with a lot of conservative Christians, there is some ambiguity as to how to regard Muslims because, on the one hand, we are on the same side regarding all the hot button social issues like LGBTQ, to a lesser extent, stuff like abortion and euthanasia. On the other hand, a lot of conservative Christians are also suspicious of Islam and Muslims because of Islamic radicalism. That was especially the case, I remember, during the early 2000s, going up to the early 2010s. Back in 2015, it's funny, I can still remember it. One of the other major issues was the Conservative Party, that we were having a federal election and the Conservative Party was campaigning on banning the niqab. So that alienated a lot of Muslims who ended up voting liberal. And that's how we ended up with Justin Trudeau, who thankfully is on his way out. That's another story. But you can see how, yeah, on some issues we're kind of on the same side, but there are other issues where it's not so much the case. It doesn't help either that a lot of conservative Christians, especially the evangelicals, not so much Catholics, but a lot of conservative evangelicals also tend to be pro-Zionist. Like they will put supporting Israel on the same level as being pro-life or pro-traditional family. Like I know evangelicals who say that they will choose a pro-abortion politician if they support Israel over a pro-life one if they don't. That's how important that particular issue is to them. But as you know, the vast majority of Muslims are on the other side of that issue. They tend to be pro-Palestine. So when they see a lot of these evangelicals espousing Zionist views, that tends to create more alienation.
We're gonna work through some arguments by Muslims for the Quran's supremacy in my study, which is a lot less than yours, but this tends to
Mhm.
be the kind of first and primary rub that Christians and Muslims will almost
Hmm.
inexhaustibly just bash their heads against. So
Yeah, that sounds
Muslim,
good. Before we go, should it's worth mentioning that I did do a two-part lecture series on this in Reason Theology a couple years back. So I believe it's called Examining Muslim Arguments for the Quran, but it's worth making note of that in case anybody wants a more in-depth explanation.
yeah, that's where I pulled a lot of these questions. I thought that was really good, so I'll drop that below in the show notes if anyone's interested in an expanded version of what we're about to go through. So Muslims often use the miracle of the Quran as a proof for its divine status and the
Hmm.
perfection of their faith. Lay out some of these arguments and problems from a Christian perspective of those arguments.
Sure. Well, the classical argument for the Quran, which up until recent times has been the most well used one, the most commonly used, is what I like to call argument from literary excellence. So there's a term in the Quran actually. It's called ijaz al-Quran. So it's the inimitability of the Quran. The idea is that the Quran is inimitable. It cannot be imitated by anybody because there are certain features of the text that could not possibly have been produced by any human hand. Um, like if any human being using ordinary human intellect or poetic talent were to attempt to imitate what is found in the Quran, they will inevitably fail in doing so. One of the main issues that I have with this argument is that there is no objective standard to actually determine what constitutes inimitability. If you ask various Muslims, what exactly is it about the Quran that makes it inimitable, you won't really get a unified answer to it. You'll hear all sorts of things from, you know, complex rhyming patterns, or they might mention that some passages will have stuff like chiasmuses that an illiterate prophet could not possibly have made, or or more often, for the less sophisticated ones, it will usually be an argument from subjective experience, like they subjectively uh, are moved by the Quran and its recitation and find that there is no other text that elicits the same response for them. So those are the various ways by which Muslims will try to argue that the Quran is inimitable. And as you can tell, a lot of it is based on, subjective criteria, but also a lot of post hoc reasoning. They'll look for specific things in the Quran that look like they can be classed as inimitable and point to that. Uh, and that actually leads me to one of my other objections to the argument from inimitability, which is that a lot of the things that they point to as evidence of inimitability actually can be found in other texts. So, for example, I'll give you the example of the chiasmus. So, for viewers who are not familiar with a chiasmus, it's basically it's sort of like a pattern where the end uh, mirrors the beginning of it. And one of the most common ones that I'll hear from Muslims is the Ayat al-Kursi, which is in Surah al-Baqarah. So if you look closely at the Ayat al-Kursi, the end part actually mirrors the beginning of it, and then the second part mirrors the second to last part, and so on and so forth till you get the middle. It forms a nice little X. And as the argument goes, how could Muhammad possibly produce this? Clearly, a divine hand must have been at work. Now, the problem is you can make the exact same argument about other texts, and in particular, because I also dabble into Mormon apologetics. Not a lot of people realize this, but this is actually an argument that Mormons use for the Book of Mormon. So LDS apologists have actually found chiasmuses in the Book of Mormon, and they will reason that, an illiterate farm boy such as Joseph Smith couldn't have possibly produced such complex patterns. So the conclusion inevitably must be that Joseph Smith did not produce the Book of Mormon, but rather it is a work of divine inspiration. Now, I would argue that if the same feature is found in both books, then it cannot be used as an argument for either of them. Or the way that I would put it, what's sauce for the Mormon goose is sauce for the Muslim gander as well. Yeah, what do you think?
I think beauty transcends. When I hear the Quran recitation, I can kind of pick up on its poetic stanza. And I do find some of them, especially I'm sure certain vocalizations, is just neutrally aesthetic in general. That doesn't make it true. That doesn't make it soteriology correct. It's just because it is beautiful doesn't mean it saves us, doesn't mean it's correct. It's
Right.
just it elicits a nice
Yes.
feeling. I would be in C.S. Lewis's camp or J.R.R. Tolkien's camp on this and that, or which are biblical. Anything good comes from God. A good singer can make
Hmm.
a crappy line sound good, right? A good actor can deliver a performance in a bad movie, right? That can
Yeah.
still elicit good emotion from me, even though I don't believe that that actor is the son of God or a prophet, right? That's where I would roughly come down on that.
Right. Now, I, I will agree with you that in general, the Quran does have some nice literary quality to it. And the recitation can sound nice, but I find it's very uneven. Like the quality of the Quran recitation, I find it's depends a lot more on the reciter himself rather than the actual text.
Do you
Um,
think there are better poetic qualities in the Meccan surahs versus the Median? Because the Median
oh,
is very lawful, whereas
yeah.
the Meccan are short
Mm,
and very
mm.
have a lot of brevity to them.
Right. Yeah, actually, the Meccan surahs are without a doubt very high quality poetry. Like I've read through some of them in Arabic, and there's no denying a lot of it is very, astounding from a literary perspective. But I find that that's not evenly distributed. If you look at Surat al-Baqarah, it's much more prosaic. You don't get the same quality from reading it that you would from reading, say, Surat al-Buruj or Surat al-Ikhlas, which are both Meccan surahs. There's one other thing I should mention here, which is there's an ongoing experiment that I have tried doing for several years now, and which I have done with a number of my friends. They have to, and they're particularly, I try to do with this with people who don't already know Arabic, because if they know Arabic, it kind of spoils it. So what I would do is I will play two recitations side by side. One is a recitation of the Quran, and the other one is a recitation of Christian liturgy, but in Arabic. So I've done this with a couple dozen of my friends at this point, who don't know Arabic, and I've always asked them after hearing the two, which one to them sounds more beautiful or more divine. Funny enough, this is my finding in doing this. The vast majority of my friends actually think the Christian liturgy sounded more divine than the Quran recitation. There's a smaller minority of them that think it's about even. They are equally beautiful or equally divine. I have yet to hear from any of my friends to whom I've subjected this experiment to that they found the Quran recitation more divine than the liturgical chant.
I
Yeah.
know the probably outside of its literary quality and that type of very subjective feelings based, which is fine. I mean, like I think English is beautiful. I actually don't. I think English being spoken out loud is not great. But that's probably because I just think other languages sound more pretty. But probably next to or maybe even greater than known argument for the Quran from a Islamic perspective would be its perfect preservation. Can you walk us through a little bit of that argument and
Yeah.
might be a
Hmm.
refutation of it or might be just a contextualization
Mm.
of it?
I mean, yeah, this isn't so much an argument for the Quran being divine as it is an argument for it being superior to the Bible, because something can be perfectly preserved and still be false. Just because something has a perfect transmission history doesn't mean its origin is divine. But a lot of Muslims do, in fact, like to boast that, oh, yeah, the Quran is perfectly preserved. It's been totally uniform for 1400 years of history. Now, the more learned ones among them will recognize that there is such a thing as variation within the Quran, but they'll argue that these variations, they're all very minor. They're just different vowelizations of the same underlying consonantal text. And I have to explain this for people who don't know Arabic. Arabic is a consonantal, Arabic writing is consonantal, which means the letters only show you the consonants. So you have to put a second set of markers on them to indicate the vowels. And it's not helped by the fact that a lot of Arabic letters look like each other. So there are some letters or consonants where the difference is a matter of how many dots you put above or below them. So, for example, the letters ba, ta, and tha are the same tooth, but with one or two or three dots on top. And then there's the letter noon. Sorry, not sorry, I'm saying on top. Ba has one below, ta has two above, tha has three above, and then one above is the letter noon. And these are all different consonants, but you can distinguish them only by the dottings. Now, this is where the claim that Muslims have starts becoming problematic because we do, in fact, have evidence of variations in the consonantal text as found in, well, there's two sources. One are what you call the companion codices. So these are non-Uthmanic codices belonging to companions such as Ibn Mas'ud and Ubay bin Ka'b, which have been preserved for us in books such as the Kitab al-Masahif, which has been translated in turn by Arthur Jeffrey back in the 1930s. And he shows that the companion codices actually have um, differences from the standard Ottomanic text, including entire words and phrases being different. One of my favorite examples is that, in Surat al-Fatiha, um, there's one ayah in Surat al-Fatiha which goes, Ihdina sirata mustaqim, guide us in the straight path. And then in Ibn Mas'ud's Mus'haf, his codex rather, his version of Surat al-Fatiha says, Ashadna as-sirat al-mustaqim. Now imagine, Surat al-Fatiha is one of the most oft-recited passages of the Quran. Muslims use it in all their salat prayers. Imagine a situation where a Muslim is doing salat, and in the middle of Fatiha, he goes, Irshadna sirata mustaqim. All the others are going to lose their minds. But that's what we find in Ibn Mas'ud's codex. Now, the other major source that we have of consonantal variants is the Sana'a palimpsest, which was discovered in Yemen in the 1970s and has been the subject of a lot of studies. So Gerard Puin was the first to write on it, and then you have what's his name? Benim Sadeghi and Mohsin Gudarzi, who both wrote a number of articles about it. And then more recently, Asma Hilali wrote a whole book where she actually provides you a transcription of both the upper and lower text of the Sana'a palimpsest and makes note of all the ways that it differs from the Othmanic text. Now, the Sana'a palimpsest is very interesting because if you look at the lower text, i.e., the text that was erased and replaced with another one, you'll find that it has a text that is Quranic, but it is not Othmanic. It has a lot of variations from the Othmanic text, and a lot of those variations include entire words and phrases being different. Now, admittedly, those words and phrases aren't huge. most of them are substituting a word with uh, a synonym. So, for example, the word Jahannam, which means hell, is replaced with the word anar, which is fire. Now, that doesn't change the meaning of the text, they mean the same thing. But if we're talking about consonantal variants, that is significant because it shows that the consonantal text did undergo some variation during the very earliest stages of the transmission of the Quran. No
You kind
problem.
of already alluded to it in this past question, but Muslims believe that the Bible is corrupted in some sense, yet they often rely upon the Bible as proof for Muhammad's prophethood. When did this belief of biblical corruption start? How did it evolve?
Yeah, so that one is actually a bit of a difficult issue to answer because different people have different ideas about where when it might have taken place. So what I've found from reading various scholars, such as Camilla Adang and what's her name, Hava Lazarus Yaffe, and also Sidney Griffith, is that most of them believe that the shift took place sometime around the 10th century. So, for example, Camilla Adang wrote a book back in the 90s called Muslim Writers on Judaism and the Hebrew Bible, where she surveys 10 different Muslim authors who cite the Hebrew Bible in their writings. And she finds that of those 10, the earliest that she can find who would explicitly mention um, biblical corruption was a fellow named Al-Maqdisi, who lived in I believe, the 10th century, might have been the early 11th. Gabriel Side Reynolds somewhat confirms this because he wrote a book looking at an early 11th century Mu'tazili theologian named Abdel Jabbar, who was a Qadi at the time. And Abdel Jabbar wrote similar arguments against the Bible, arguing that it was corrupted. And he wrote these either in the late 10th or the early 11th century. But the one who really made the argument popular and codified it into the form we most recognize today is Ibn Hazm, who wrote, who I mentioned earlier, in the 11th century, he wrote a book called The Thistle, which is literally translates to the separator, where he argues for the truth of his particular interpretation of Islam against every other religious viewpoint. And when he gets to Judaism and Christianity, the main argument that he raises has to do with errors and contradictions in the Bible. Prior to him, other Muslim apologists did quote the Bible, but it was mainly to find proofs of prophecy in them or to find passages that might contradict Christian doctrine. So, for example, going back in time to, I believe, the early 9th century, you had another Muslim writer named Ibn Rabban, who I believe was an historian Christian who converted to Islam. So he had the advantage of actually knowing the contents of the Bible. And he wrote a book on what is known as Dalail an-Nubuwah, Proofs of Prophecy. I forgot the exact title. Dalail an-Nubuwah is the genre of the literature, but he argues that Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible, and he assembles a long catena of biblical texts to prove this. Uh, he will a lot of the classical passages that you hear to this day, such as the Paraclete passage in Deuteronomy or the illiterate man in Isaiah 29, actually find their origins in Ibn Rabban. He was the first to assert that these are prophecies of Muhammad. Interestingly, if you look at Ibn Rabban's use of the Bible, at no point does he ever accuse the text he's citing of being manipulated or falsified. He takes for granted that these books are of divine origin and that they can be cited um, as divine scriptures in defense of Islam. The idea that it was um, corrupted, that the Jews or the Christians had falsified the text, doesn't come out until much later.
You already mentioned some of the passages that Muslims will use for the proof of Muhammad's prophethood from the Bible. Why don't you give us a quick rundown of the Paraclete, Deuteronomy. I know Song of Songs is a big one, bizarre reasoning, but why don't you give us, just a little bit of overview of how those are used and why they fail.
They have to do this. So Muslims do actually need to find some sort of proof for for Muhammad being prophesied about in the Quran, because the Quran, sorry, in the Quran, in the Bible, because the Quran itself says so. So I believe the passage in question is it's in Surah Al-Araf, Surah 7, 157, where it says, الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة بالمعروف وينهاهم والإنجيل والأناجيل. Yeah, Injil. I know some Muslim is going to take that clip and use it to prove that I don't actually know Arabic, but be that as it may, in the English translation, it says, these are those who follow the messenger, the prophet, who the unlettered one, who they find written about with them in the Torah and in the gospel, which are with them. So in the Quran, it says, in no uncertain terms, they should find a description of Muhammad in their writings. Now, there's another one. It's a little less direct, and it's in Surah Al-Thaf, which is the 61st surah. And in the ayah 6 of Surah Al-Saf, it says, وَإِذْ قَالَ عِيسَى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعدي اسمه أحمد. So, and when Jesus said, the son of Maryam said, O children of Israel, truly I am the messenger of God to you, confirming what is between the hands of the Torah and bearing glad tidings of a messenger coming after me whose name is Ahmed. So, according to Surah Asaf, Jesus predicted that another prophet would come after him, whose name will be the most praised one, literally. Ahmed here can be construed as a title rather than the actual name. What Muslims have done is they've tried to find something in Jesus' words in the Gospels that might correspond to what the Islamic Jesus says in Surat Asaf. And the oldest, most commonly used passage in that regard is the Paraclete passage in John 14 to 16. In fact, the earliest recorded use of it in a Muslim text to prove the prophet of Muhammad is the Sirah of Ibn Ishaq, which was written in the mid 8th century. So Ibn Ishaq's Sirah actually quotes a version of the Paraclete passage to prove that Muhammad was foretold by Jesus in the gospel. They actually have to finesse the text a little bit and quote selectively because, as I like to point out to people, the easiest way to prove that the Paraclete is not Muhammad is to simply read the whole thing from beginning to end. Because if you do that, you'll find that there's all sorts of things that are said about the Paraclete that could not possibly refer to Muhammad. So
And
let me
what
give you
does that particular Greek word mean, or is closest
right.
translation?
Yeah, so the word in Greek is parakletos. So if you look at different translations of the Bible, you'll look at all kinds of translations. The one that most people are familiar with because of the King James Version is the Comforter. Now you look at more modern translations, they'll render it as something like the Helper, the Advocate. I don't know, remember what the others were.
Mm.
But parakletos comes from the Greek verb parakaleo, which means like to come beside someone. That's the literal meaning, but figuratively it has connotation of rendering assistance to someone, to encourage them, to basically, be a good friend, to make sure that they are doing well. when things are not so good. So the Parakletos is the one who comes beside believers and assists them in their trials. Of course, Muslims will say that the Parakletos is Muhammad, but if you look at the Paraclete passage, there's all sorts of things there that don't match the description of Muhammad. So I'll give you an example. John 14, verse 26. And I'm quoting the ESV for those who are interested. Jesus says, "But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." So right there, we have a problem. First of all, the text explicitly says that the Parakletos is the Holy Spirit. There's no ambiguity there. Now, Muslims don't believe Muhammad is the Holy Spirit. Now, it goes on and says that the Father will send him in my name, in Jesus' name. Does Muhammad come in Jesus' name? Of course not. And he'll teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. So everything that Jesus has said will be brought to remembrance by Muhammad. Now, you look at the Quran, there's not a lot of Jesus teaching in there. You might get snippets here and there, but nothing close to all that Jesus has said. So again, he fails the test there. John 15, verse 26. "But when the Helper comes, whom I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, who proceeds from the Father, he will bear witness about me." Jesus is the one who sends the Paraclete. Did Jesus send Muhammad? No Muslim's going to claim that. Again, he's called a spirit. He's the Spirit of truth. Muhammad is not a spirit. He proceeds from the Father. Well, Muslims don't even believe that God is a father. So how can they believe that this can apply to Muhammad? John 16, verses 13 and 14. "When the Spirit of truth comes, he will guide you into all truth, for he'll not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak." Now, Muslims like to quote that one and say that definitely applies to Muhammad. But then they don't go on to say what comes after that. "He'll declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, for he will take what is mine and declare to you." Now, does Muhammad glorify Jesus? Does he take what is Jesus's? Well, clearly not. So once again, the only way you can say that these passages about Muhammad is to carefully splice out certain passages from the Paraclete passage and ignore the whole thing.
Why don't you walk us through the Deuteronomy? And I'm always a fan of them using Song of Songs, and I think people who don't know that would find that pretty fun. Why don't you give us those two real quick?
So here is relevant passages, Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 to 20. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. Just as you desired of the Lord your God Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, 'Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, or see this great fire any more, lest I die.' And the Lord said to me, They are right in what they have spoken. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words, that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die." So the argument is that "from among your brothers" is a reference to the Ishmaelites, and God is and Moses declaring that the Lord will raise a prophet from among the Ishmaelites. Muhammad then is the Ishmaelite prophet who is being foretold in this passage. Now, there are a number of assumptions being made. One of the main assumptions being made is that brother must refer to Ishmaelites. Now, here's a problem, and anyone can do this. Do a quick search for the word brother throughout the book of Deuteronomy so you can see how it's used. There are only two places in the entire book of Deuteronomy where the word brother is used to refer to non-Israelites. That is in Deuteronomy 2, verse 4 and Deuteronomy 2, verse 8. In both cases, it is used to refer to the Edomites. And we know that is the case because the context tells us that it is about the Edomites. But if you look at every other instance of the word brother throughout the book of Deuteronomy, in every place where it appears, it is clearly a reference to fellow Israelites. In fact, that is how it is used in the immediate context of Deuteronomy 18. So For example, Deuteronomy 17, verse 15, it says, "You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother." So notice that brother and foreigner are contrasted with each other, saying that a brother is a fellow Israelite. It's used the same way in Deuteronomy 17, verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. So again, clearly, a brother here refers to a brother Israelite. Or let's look at Deuteronomy 18, verses 1 and 2. "The Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's food offerings as their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among their brothers. The Lord is their inheritance as he promised them." Once again, brother here cannot refer to anything other than a fellow Israelite. Except for two places that clearly state in the context that they're referring to Edomites, every use of the word brother in Deuteronomy refers to brother Israelites. Another thing that should be noted here is that the passage in Deuteronomy 18 is quoted twice in the book of Acts. So the first time that it's quoted is by St. Peter in his sermon to the people of Jerusalem in Acts 3, verse 22, where it says, "Moses said, the Lord God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you." And then the second time is St. Stephen, who quotes the same passage in Acts chapter 7, verse 37. So in both cases, both St. Peter and St. Stephen take the passage in Deuteronomy 18 and they say that it's about Jesus. So from a Christian perspective, if we're to read the Old Testament in light of the New, we have to agree with both St. Peter and St. Stephen, who said that the prophet in question is the Messiah, Jesus.
And the Song of Songs, which is, I think you could probably answer in 3 sentences, but I'll let you
Yeah,
go as long as needed.
Song of Solomon 5:16. It says, "His mouth is most sweet, and he's altogether desirable. This is my beloved, and this is my friend, O daughters of Jerusalem." The argument is based on a specific word that's used in the Hebrew. So in the Hebrew, it says, "Chiko mamtakim vechulo machamadim ze dodi veze re'i bnot Yerushalayim." So notice that the word for desirable in the Hebrew is mahamadim. And if you say it that way, it sounds a little bit like Muhammad. So they'll argue that the altogether desirable one is Muhammad himself. This assumes that similarity in sound must mean that it's the same word. Here's the problem with that. Now, Hebrew and Arabic are cousin languages. They have a similar grammatical structure, and in that grammatical structure, you have like the three consonants, and then you build around those three consonants, and the three consonants tell you what the basic meaning is. The problem is that the same three consonants are not always used the same way between the two languages, because in Arabic, the verb hamada means to praise. So Muhammad literally means the praised one. Now, the problem is that in Hebrew, the equivalent verb hamad does not mean to praise. It means to desire or to take delight in. So a mahmad in Hebrew is something that is desired or something that is seen as desirable. So already you got a problem that the word doesn't even mean the same thing as its Arabic counterpart. The other problem with this is that you can't use this argument gets really ridiculous once you start applying it to every other instance of the word Mahmad as found in the Hebrew Bible. So let me pull up Brown Driver Briggs. It's a Hebrew lexicon. Now,
Well, it
under
sounds like this is a home phone fallacy, right? Where in two
yeah,
words that are the same, can even be spelled the same in different languages, mean
Yeah.
totally different things.
So yeah,
Lightning, Lightning versus lightning are
mhm.
different. There are words in Dutch and German that are spelled the exact same as they are in English, but mean totally different things.
Oh yeah, there's all sorts of weird theories around this. So I remember some conspiracy theorists back in the early 2000s argued that Christianity originated from worshiping the sun, S-U-N. His argument was, well, sun, S-U-N sounds a lot like sun, S-O-N. So clearly it must have developed from there. The problem is you're assuming these people spoke English. Now, in Hebrew, it's a little bit more plausible, emphasis on a little bit, because Arabic and Hebrew are cousin languages. They're both Semitic languages, and they both use the same basic grammatical structure. Problem is that the same, as I mentioned, the same three consonants can have a different meaning between languages. So in Brown Driver Briggs, first of all, under Hamad, which means to delight or to take pleasure in, they have the participial form Mahmad, which means something that is desired or a desirable thing. And it appears a number of different places. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to pull up a few places that use the word Mahmad. Let's see. Hosea chapter 9, verse 6. For behold, they are going away from destruction, but Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them, Netel shall possess the precious things of silver, i.e., the mahmad of silver, thorns shall be in their tents. So if we apply the same logic, it says that nettles shall possess Muhammad and thorns shall be in his tents. Clearly, that is not does not make sense at all. Now let's find another one. First Kings chapter 20, verse 6. It says, nevertheless, I will send my servants to you tomorrow about this time, and they shall search your house and the houses of your servants and lay hands on whatever pleases you, in Hebrew, kol mahmad, and take it away. So according to this, Muhammad is taken away by the Babylonians, sorry, the Syrians. Well, clearly that doesn't work. You get the point. Let me find just one more example just to drive the point home. Let's see if I can find a good one. Let's go with Second Chronicles 36:19. And they burned the house of God, that is to say, the Babylonians, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burnt all its palaces with fire and destroyed all its precious vessels. V'chol kle machmadea lehashchit. So, according to this, Muhammad was destroyed in a fire by the Babylonians. Clearly not, but you can see if you take the argument to its logical conclusion, you're going to have to say that every other instance of Mahmad in the Hebrew Bible refers to Muhammad, and that creates those kinds of nonsense readings.
Thanks for that nice little teaching lesson. In your multi-faith bridge building work, have you seen anyone convert to Christianity, or at least Muslims become a little bit more soft towards Christian ideals, Christian teachings?
Um, I've, I've definitely met plenty of Muslims who've converted to Christianity. None, in fact, I'm gonna meet one of them tomorrow. He's doing a talk at U of T to share his testimony. None of them, I can't really take credit for any of them. Most of the Muslim converts that I know were already Christian or have already converted by the time I met them. There's a lot of different factors. Uh, like some of them, it's due to apologetics, it's due to examining the arguments fair and square and concluding that Christianity makes a better case. Sometimes it's because, they read through the Gospels and find the image of Jesus that they find they're so compelling, they can't help but embrace it. A lot of other times, Muslims convert because of a supernatural experience, like they might have a dream of Jesus or the Virgin Mary might come to them in their dreams. I actually know a friend who's a Catholic who converted because the Virgin Mary appeared to him in his dreams. So I'm not going to name this person because he is still crypto Muslim. So he's converted, but he's still presenting himself as Muslim, so his community does not harm him. But these kinds of things happen. So, in fact, it seems that of all the factors that might induce Muslims to convert to Christianity, supernatural experiences like visions of Jesus or the Virgin Mary are by far the most common.
Very interesting. In what way would you have people go forward or engage with Muslims? I think first and foremost, you should learn a little bit more about the religion, but in what ways should you go about that? Should you start with mosque? Should you just go to an informal meeting? What ways would you just recommend Christians who want to get into that apologetics or even just bridge building interfaith workspace?
The first thing I would say is brush up on it by reading firsthand sources, like get a good translation of the Quran. I have two in particular that I would highly recommend. The first one is the Study Quran, edited by Syed Hussein Nasser. This one's nice because not only does it give you a fairly accurate translation of the Quran, the text, the footnotes, are geared towards telling you the classical commentaries on the Quran. So it relies on figures such as Ar-Razi, At-Tabari, Ibn Kathir, etc., and they tell you what does each commentator tell you about any given verse. So you get the classical interpretations. This is the one I would recommend you carry with you if you're going to a mosque or an interfaith meeting. It's also highly academic in quality, so you can use it in academic settings as well. There's another one. It's called The Quran with Christian Commentary. It's edited by Gordon Nickel, and it uses the A.J. Droog translation, which I find is very accurate. It actually of all the English translations of the Quran I've perused, this translation is actually the most word-for-word literal. So if you want to get a feel for how the Arabic text actually flows, this one does a better job than almost any other that I know. And the nice thing about this is that all of the other features, like the articles, the footnotes, they're geared towards explaining elements of the Quran that would be relevant in a Christian-Muslim dialogue, such as doctrinal differences or Quranic stories that have biblical parallels. Now, because this is
we've actually had Dr. Nickel on the podcast. Okay. I'll link his interview below for anyone that's interested.
Great. I will say this, because this is a Quran translation with commentary written by Christians for Christians. I wouldn't recommend bringing this with you to a mosque or an interfaith gathering. This is more of a resource that you should keep at home with you and read on your own time.
Or what I've suggested to people is if you think that's $40 or $50, just kind of expensive for a book. I always recommend people, if your church has a library or if it even just has maybe stipend for books, ask your church or maybe even a local library to purchase that, and then you can just have it on hand.
Yes. Now, at the risk of potentially upsetting Dr. Nickel, if he ever hears me say this, if you only have the money to buy one of these two, go with the Study Quran.
Thank you, Lewis, for coming on. Anyone who wants to interact with Lewis, I'll put YouTube channel, Reason and Theology, below, his academia.edu account, as well as his Twitter account that he's very active on. Sorry, it's never going to be X. Lewis, thank you so much for coming on, and we'll see everyone next week on Church Coffee.
Hey, have you been benefiting from this channel, but you're not supporting it?
You're definitely guilty.
Get over to patreon.com/Reason and Theology and support this channel if you've been benefiting from the content.
Did I say get it done now?
I mean right now!
And if you can't support the show financially, you should at least be subscribed, right? Am I right or am I right?
Yeah, I think he's right.
I'm right. So go and hit the subscribe button right now.